think we can get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone present here today. Thank you so much for joining in. Welcome to this new episode of Apex Office Hours JPAC series. Today's topic is incorporating MS Office 365 services into your Oracle Apex apps. To present this interesting topic, we have a special guest with us today. He is John Dixon. So a little bit about John Dixon, our special guest today. John has been working with Oracle Technologies since 1996. As an employee of Oracle Consulting for 18 years, he has focused on delivering integrations and extensions of Oracle e-business suite and Fusion ERP cloud applications. Over the past 8 years, John has focused on delivering innovative solutions using Oracle Apex and ORDS. Welcome, John. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Tawfiq. Appreciate that welcome. And welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody who's joined and everyone who's watching the recording. I'm just going to share my screen. If I could share my screen, Tawfiq. There we go. Thanks. Right. All right. Welcome, and thank you for the introduction, Tawfiq, to my presentation on integrating Microsoft Office 365 services into your Apex apps. We've been through my bio. You can reach me, my social media, LinkedIn, X, that kind of stuff through the Linktree link you see there. You can also scan that QR code and it'll take you to that Linktree app as well. At the end of the presentation, I have another QR code where you can download the slides from also if you want to take a look at the slides. Obviously, you can also listen to this recording later on. So I'll get stuck right in and we'll take a look at the agenda for today. So I'm going to start by going through what is telling you a little bit about Microsoft Graph API. So it's kind of the underpinnings behind the ability for us to integrate with Office 365 services. So we need to understand a bit about the Microsoft Graph API. Then I'll take you through calling an example Graph API. We'll get into Postman, we'll create a credential in Microsoft and call the Calendar API just so we can see how the API operates. Then I have a pretty full-featured Apex application that I'm going to demo. So we'll see SharePoint, email, calendar, all that integrated with Apex. And as I go through the demo, we'll jump into the code behind the scenes so you guys can see the code and see what's going on there. I'll finish up by going through lessons learned. So places where I've implemented these integrations before, what lessons I've learned, and share those with you guys. And then we'll go through any questions, I think, in the chat when we get to the end of the presentation. All right, so what is the Microsoft Graph API? So you can kind of think about it as an interconnected web of REST services behind a unified REST endpoint. So if you're accessing user information, emails, SharePoint, calendar, you're kind of accessing the same multiple REST APIs, but through a unified REST endpoint. And one of the benefits of this is you get standardized patterns. So if you want to filter calendar entries or if you want to filter emails, that filter parameter for the web service is the same for each of those services. Same goes for selecting fields or pagination, how to handle pagination in these services. Once you have a handle on one of them, it's pretty straightforward to switch to another one. They also have a unified security model. So once you have a set of credentials and you get a token, which we'll be talking about today, if you have the right permissions, that same token can be used to access calendar, email, SharePoint, whatever you're trying to access. So it kind of makes it easy. Once you get used to one service, you can easily move on to other services in the graph set of APIs. So before we get into the how, let's look at the why, first of all. So let's look at some use cases. So from an email perspective, why might you want to integrate with Office 365 email? Well, one common use case is AP invoices. So you might have suppliers that send you an AP invoice every month with their invoice attached as a PDF. So you can poll that inbox from Apex, and maybe using an Apex automation every 15 minutes or so, check to see if a new email's arrived, and then potentially send the PDF from the invoice to OCI document recognition to get the data out of that PDF document. And if you're feeling particularly fancy, maybe even programmatically start creating your AP invoice in your ERP system. Another use case is a ticketing system. So you might have users who email a support email inbox with issues with their laptop or whatever. You can poll that inbox every so often, check for a new email, and then programmatically create a ticket in that ticketing system. Similarly, you could respond to responses to emails in the ticketing system to maybe update tickets. From a calendar perspective, common use case is resource scheduling. So you might have an Apex app where you schedule resources and book resources and book appointments in those resources calendars. So maybe you have field service technicians who just want to look at their Outlook calendar on their phone to see what they have to do that day. You can schedule those resources via an Apex app. There are multiple different REST APIs, Graph REST APIs that you can use to check for availability and that kind of thing. Another interesting use case might be meeting analysis. So you could look at all the meetings that happened in your organization over the past week, for example, look at all the attendees of those meetings, and maybe even try and figure out the costs of those meetings during that week's period, or do other analysis on calendar and meetings that happen in your organization. Finally, if we look at SharePoint, one obvious use case is document storage. So we shouldn't be storing PDFs and Excel files in blob columns in the database anymore. So one option could be to share those documents in SharePoint, store them in SharePoint, and then access those documents through your Apex app. And the final use case is shareable links. So in SharePoint and OneDrive, you can generate a link that expires in a certain period of time, where you can call APIs to generate those links. So from your Apex app, you might share a link to a video that somebody can use for a day or something like that. So you can share documents without having to give them a login to SharePoint. So next, let's look at security. So I mentioned there's one mechanism for securing access to the Graph APIs. So there's a Azure AD endpoint, which we'll look at, which you pass a client ID and client secret to, and that will give you a token, which you can then use to call all the different Graph services, depending on the authorization or the grants that you've given to that application. As Apex developers, we understand that as a web credential, so that those client credentials that we create in Microsoft, we can set up in a web credential, and then Apex will take care of getting the token for us and managing the expiration of that token. And we'll look at that also in a few minutes. So in order to get the security side of this set up, you have to use a tool called Microsoft Entra, which is relatively new in the Microsoft arena. And you create a application definition or application registration, I should say. To do this, you have to have admin access to your Office 365 tenancy. And when you've created that app registration, which we'll do, you then grant permissions to that application registration. So one registration could have access to calendar, email, or just one of them if you want to keep them separate. And then you create a set of OAuth 2 credentials. So you get a client ID and client secret, which have a certain expiration, and you need to keep renewing those credentials every so often. So before we go ahead and see how to set that up, there's one word of warning. So when you create an application registration and give it a permission, so let's say we give it the permission mail read write, that gives that app registration and the credentials associated with it the ability to read from or write to any email address in your organization, which is pretty scary. All is not lost. Although it's not that straightforward, you can restrict that for mail and calendar. So you can use PowerShell to apply restrictions to an app registration to only operate on a certain username or group. So you could say for calendar, only users in this group, this app registration can act upon. To do that PowerShell setup, you do have to have a Microsoft Cloud account in addition to your Office 365 account. It doesn't cost anything to do that, but you do have to set up that Microsoft Cloud account to do the PowerShell piece. I won't be going through the PowerShell piece in today's presentation, but I do have a blog on this. In the introduction blog I have to this series of integrations with Office 365, I go into detail on how to perform that extra step to secure email and calendar. But for SharePoint, once you create that app registration, you have access to all the SharePoint sites and folders. Or that application credential does. All right, so let's go ahead and get that setup started. So I'm in Microsoft Entra. There's entra.microsoft.com. You log in as the administrator of your Office 365 tenancy. And I'm going to go ahead and set up an application registration for this session. So I'll call it Office Hours. So that creates a basic shell of an application registration. I'm going to need the client ID. So I'm just going to copy that off to one side momentarily. And we need to grant it permissions. I'm going to add a permission. I'm going to add a Microsoft Graph permission and an application permission. And you can search through all the different Microsoft services. For the demo, I'm going to do calendars read. So this will give this application registration access to read any calendar in my organization. As I say, you can go ahead, on top of this, do the PowerShell piece to restrict it to certain users. And I also need to grant admin consent for my organization. So there's a couple of steps you have to go through to get that green check mark. Next, I need to create a client secret to go along with that client ID. I'm going to pull this Office Hours also. You can set those for a set duration, but I think the most is 24 months. So you will have to recycle and update your client secrets every so often, which is obviously good practice. Once you've created a secret, you need the secret value. So I'm going to copy that guy also and save it. So next, let's see how, from Postman, how we can get a token and call the calendar API. So to get a token, you call this login.microsoftonline.com, and then this string in between here is my tenancy ID in Microsoft 365, and you can see that if you go to the overview section, you can get your tenant ID from there. And then at the end, it's OAuth 2 version 2 token. So then I just need to put in my client ID and client secret stored. And that gives me a token. I'm going to copy that token. So this is a JWT, a JSON Web Token. And you can even inspect this token to get some further information from it. So if you go to the site, jwt.ms, paste the token in there, it will decode parts of the token. So you can see the roles that this token has access to, and you can see the application registration name, a bunch of other bits of information. So if you might have code, you might want to decode that JWT and double check the roles that JWT has before you perform certain actions in Apex. I just wanted to show you what's going on there. But for our purposes, we're just going to grab that token. Just going to show you basic call to calendar information. So this is the main graph endpoint, and then we're going to look at users and then my username. So this is going to be calendar events for john@cloudmaven.com. You can also pass the internal user ID. So under users, my user, calendars related to that user, and then calendar events for that user. You can see there's also other parameters there, and I'll go through those in a minute. I'm just going to put in as a bearer token that token that we just retrieved. Now I can call that service and I get a bunch of my meeting invites, my meetings. So let's have a look through the parameters, because these will play an important part when we get into the Apex side. So the select parameter for the Graph API allows you to select specific fields, which is quite useful from a performance perspective, especially because instead of selecting all 50 fields related to a calendar entry, or 40 or however many there are, you can just select the ones you want, which will keep the size of the payload smaller, improve performance across the network, and improve performance in the parsing time for Apex to pass that response. So it's always a good idea to just select the fields you need. And similarly, you can narrow the width of what you're collecting. You can also narrow the number of records you return by adding filter criteria. So this is just an example of the syntax that you can use. So I'm looking for any meeting that started October the 1st, 7 UTC, and the subject contains the letter A. Obviously, there's many other filter criteria you could pass. I'm grabbing the top 10 records, so the top and the count parameters where pagination comes into play. So each service has a limit to the total number of records that you can get in one fetch. It's typically around 200. So in this case, I'm fetching the first 10 records, and I've also requested that I get a count of how many records in total match the criteria that I've entered. So in this case, it's telling me there's a total of 30 records that I could get, but it's obviously only given me the first 10 because I've asked for the top 10. And then you can see the different fields in the JSON. And if I go all the way to the bottom, because there are more records to fetch, I have this OData next link field. And this has the complete URL. So if I click on this and open a new Postman tab, I'll still need to grab the token. You still need to pass the token with each request. But Microsoft's essentially giving you everything you need to fetch the next 10 records. So if I do, bearer token. So now it's got me the next 10 records. And because I know there's 30, there's another 10 down here. And if you look closer, you can see it's passing a skip parameter to skip, because this is the second set of 10 records I fetched. One thing you might have noticed in the response is that I'm requesting stuff back in calendar entries back in Pacific Standard Time. Obviously, time zone is very important when you're dealing with calendar entries. You could either pick the time zone related to your user, or you could just get everything back in UTC and convert it on the Apex side if you prefer. But it's important to at least understand what time zone those results are coming back in and to specify it, whether it's the user's time zone or whether you specify UTC. Just be aware of that. All right, so now we have an idea of how the Graph API works. We've gone through permissions, calling the API from Postman. Let's look at the demo app. So we're going to look at integrations for users, so Active Directory users, SharePoint, email, and calendar, and we'll look at the Apex code that's behind the scenes. So this is the app. We can log in with Microsoft Office 365 as well. It's a topic for another day, but using social sign-on, we can sign in with Microsoft, which I'm going to do. And then I have various tabs here. So these are the users in my tenancy. So this is calling the user API, which I won't look at for this session, but it's basically another REST endpoint. I have applied for the web credential that I'm using for the demo. I have applied that security, so I can only see calendar entries and email for my user. So if I go to Sandra's user, for example, it's not very elegant, the error message, but it's basically telling me I don't have access to that. But I can see mine. So let's start. I'm looking at my calendar. So this is a standard calendar region type in Apex. I'm just using a REST source for the data source of that. So let's see how I'm doing that. Just move this down a bit. So the calendar is page 20. So let's see how that's working. So as you can see, it's a standard calendar region, and it's using a REST source to get the data. So let's have a quick look at that REST source. So we saw this endpoint in Postman just now. I have a remote server set up at the workspace level with the root path of the graph endpoint. And then the URL for the calendar specific entries is this. And then I've got the user ID as a parameter to that, just like we saw in Postman. I'm not dealing with pagination at this point, and you'll see why shortly. I have some web credentials that I already have set up, and I'll go through the process of adding a new web credential in a little while. And I have a authentication server also set up with that URL that includes my tenant Office 365 tenancy in it. So Apex has everything it needs to go grab a token using this authentication piece, and then use that token to then call the REST endpoint to get the calendar entries. I also have some parameters. So I've got these filter parameters that we saw in the Postman example. The select, so I'm just selecting certain fields. I'm selecting the first 200 records, and I'm also selecting a specific time zone. And have a user ID as a parameter, just as a default with my user ID. So I can test this web service call from here, and it will get those calendar entries. So then once that's on the Apex side, Apex, because it's a REST data source, Apex treats that response like it is any other table. So these columns from the data source, from the data profile, are what you would deal with from an Apex perspective. And these are the selectors from the JSON response that is coming back from the REST API. So one benefit of using a REST source over custom code, which we'll also see shortly, is that you can add caching. So if I edit the get operation, I don't know if you noticed, but if I hit refresh, it's maybe 3 seconds to refresh. I can enable caching for the session, let's say, and say refresh the cache every 15 minutes. Now, the first time I hit refresh, it's going to take the same amount of time because it's having to fetch that data, but now it should have it cached, and you can see it's almost instantaneous. Now, there's a trade-off, obviously, that data is cached for 15 minutes, so any calendar entries that get added in that 15-minute time period, you won't see. So as with most things related to performance, there are trade-offs involved in how fast you want it to go and how much your system can handle. So that gives us an idea of how you can use that REST source and that graph API and and fit it into a standard Apex widget. Next, I will show you that you can then also, so if I pick this meeting invite, so in the initial query to get all the calendar entries, I just got the bare basics of the fields that I needed to populate the calendar region. And then when you click on a calendar entry, page 22, I'm again using a REST source, but this time using a form type region, and using a different REST source that is similar, but it's just a bit more specific. It's gone one level down. So if I look at Microsoft Office calendar event, and you can see that URL, we've now gone calendar events, and now we're looking at a specific event ID. So on page 20, when you click on a calendar event, it's going to page 22 and passing that event ID so that it can get details for that specific event. And then there's another region, I won't go into that in the detail, but so there's another API endpoint you can call to get the invitees for a calendar event. So this is showing the invitees for this particular meeting. It's happening tomorrow. So that's calendar, basically just showing how it can interface with Apex, but there are other APIs we can call to create calendar events, search for availability, all that good stuff. So now let's look at my email. So this is my inbox as it stands right now. I'm going to take a quick look at this first email. So I've sent myself a test email just so we can see the attachment, an example with an attachment. So I have a similar kind of approach where I've got a basic interactive report, in this case, on a REST source that's looking at the inbox entries. Then a pop-up with a form type region, also on a REST source, that's giving me the details for the calendar entry. So for example, if I looked at this second email, there's quite a lot of content in that email. So I wouldn't want to fetch all of that content for every row here. Thankfully, Microsoft provides an additional field for like a summarized version of the email. I think it's the first 100 characters or so. So you can use that in kind of a preview mode. And then for the emails you particularly want to look at, you can fetch the entire content. And that can be, you know, a club, very large amount of data indeed. In this case, I have an attachment. So I have a button that I'm flagging. So there's a field in the calendar entries response that tells you whether there's an attachment for that, email response that tells you whether there's an attachment. You get the MIME type, essentially everything you need to be able to grab that file. So I'll just download it so you can see that happening. So it's downloaded that file. So let's take a quick look at how we did that. So page 41. So this is that modal that I just showed with the attachments button. That attachments button is going to page 45 with the particular message ID. And that's showing me a list of the attachments. So all of these are REST sources with just the path going one level further down the chain to be more specific to email, to inbox, to particular email, to attachments for that email. And then I have a derived column, which is the link that we saw, this download link. That is calling an application process called download attachment. And just as an FYI, all the code for this demo app is available. I have a link at the end of the presentation, but I have a GitHub account out there with all of the code that you're seeing here today. So you can look at that or try it out yourselves. There's an application process that's setting some values into session state. from that particular record in the list of attachments, and then calling this application process, just so you can see that. Application process is then calling a package procedure. And I'll just show you that briefly. So here I'm using Apex Web Service. So I have a setup table that has the URL, has the endpoint for the attachment service. So, sorry, I'll just show you that quickly so it kind of makes sense. So this email attachment endpoint. So it's basically the URL for the attachments get API with some substitution strings in it. So I'm just substituting those values with the parameters that were passed in, creating a URL encoded request header. I'm using the Apex export utility to export the file. So I'm populating that record type that you need to populate for that. So it's calling Apex Web Service to get the blob from Microsoft Office. It's using the token URL that I have a function that basically gets the token URL and passes the credential, the Apex Web credential in. Assuming I get a successful response from that, I continue to populate the export record with the file name and the MIME type, and then I can use Apex Data Export, which is what's actually downloading that blob. So in summary, calling this procedure from an application process, using Apex Web Service to fetch that attachment, and then downloading the attachment with Apex Data Export. All right, so the last piece of the demo side of things, the SharePoint sites. So this is a list of all the SharePoint sites in my tenancy. And for the SharePoint, I went a different way about it. So here, page 30. So instead of using the native REST sources, I've used pipeline table functions just to show you something different. So here I've got an interactive grid, which is showing the SharePoint sites that are in my tenancy. And I'm selecting it from this, although you don't need to do this in the more recent versions of the database, I'm using this table option to indicate that this is a pipeline table function. And it's calling this pipeline function called SP sites. And the beauty of pipeline functions is, as far as Apex is concerned, this is just a table. So it's created, it's given me all the columns back, but I could have any code in that pipeline function if I want to generate the records for that table. So if I just grab the name of that function. So what I'm doing here is using Apex Web Service again to call a Microsoft Graph endpoint that gets SharePoint sites, my tenancy. I'm populating some of those parameters that we've seen before. So you can see these APIs are all pretty similar. I'm doing a select, and I'm just selecting the name of the site, the display name, and the IDs for those sites, which is important. And optionally passing a filter, which, as you can see, I'm passing a null value here. Use Apex Web Service again to grab that club, and then I'm using JSON table and a cursor to pass that club. So I'm getting the name, the display name, the SharePoint IDs come out in a sub-object in the JSON. So I'm getting the site ID and the site URL. And for a pipeline table function, you specify a record type. So let's look at the record type for the SharePoint sites is SharePoint site record. I've specified this record type. It's going to store that name, display name, site ID, and site URL that we just saw. So then that cursor is going to loop through the JSON response, go through each record, populate the record type, populate the record, I should say, and then pipe that record. So when you see that these records show up here, that's that what's happening is it's calling that web service, passing the JSON response and piping it out to Apex, and Apex just sees it as if it was selecting from a regular table. So if I pick one of these sites, testing, and I have, so this is now going one level further in the SharePoint REST API. So it's for a particular site. I am now, and you can see the site ID in the parameter at the top here. I'm now calling the API and saying, give me all the folders and files for that site. And then it's just traversing a folder structure, and you keep passing the folder structure to the API, and it will tell you what's in that folder. So for page 35, now for this page, you might notice that I have two options here. One is to use a pipeline table function. So I'll show you that first. Choose this guy. So I have this function called SharePoint folder list. Similar approach. Again, I'm just using Apex Web Service to call the endpoint for the SharePoint files and folders. I'm passing in the path that I've navigated to. So the path is slightly different for the root folder versus any folders beneath that. I'm basically filling out that path to that folder so that the REST API will give me the contents of that particular folder. And then I'm starting a loop because I'm asking for the first 200 records in this case, but I might have 1,000 files in that SharePoint site. So I'm starting a loop, a potentially indefinite loop. If I'm on the second iteration, if you remember in the calendar entries, when you have more data, you have this OData next link in the response. And it gives you that entire URL that you need to call for the second set, in this case, second set of 200 records. So once I get to the second iteration, I need to remove the parameters that I started off with because I'm going to use what the API gives me for the next iteration. I call the API, get my 200 records, again using JSON table. I pass that. And this is where pipeline table functions can be useful because you can have other logic in there. So I could do math in here. I could be selecting records from other tables to supplement the records that I return. When I get to the end of that loop, I check if there's that OData next link in the response. If there is, then I set the URL for the next iteration to whatever the value it returned, because it's already told me, it's put that skip in there, so it's going to get me the next set of records. And then if I have any errors, I handle those appropriately. And at the end of the loop, if there wasn't any more records, I set this flag to say stop the loop. And then if that Boolean is saying stop, or if I've got this fail safe, in case it goes beyond 20 iterations, I stop anyway, and it just exits the loop. Otherwise, it goes back around, fetches the next 200 records. So that's how it's fetching those records. We can do anything in here. So if I go into a folder, let's lots of files again. So there's a few hundred files in this folder, I think. I can add files, and we'll see that in a few seconds. Add that file. And I'll show you how I do this in a second. And I can search the content of that folder for that file. I can download the file. That's downloaded the file, and I can delete the file. So you can essentially recreate whatever SharePoint is doing from your Apex application. which isn't very useful in its own right because you can use SharePoint for that, but it shows you can interact with those files, add files, delete files as you need to. And I'll show you the add and delete in a second, but first of all, I just wanted to show you another option, which is using an Apex collection. So I'm looking at the exact same folder. This time I've populated a collection with the data from the web service instead of a pipeline table function. So just a condition on this to call this procedure if we're in Apex collection mode. And it's doing the exact same thing using Apex web service, preparing the parameters, looping around, fetching 200 records at a time. The only difference is at the end of each iteration, it's adding the record to an Apex collection. And the possible pros and cons of this, obviously an Apex collection is going to be, like if I search on this Apex collection, it's searching the collection, not the REST source, so it's pretty much instantaneous. You'll see if I do a search using a pipeline table function, it's quite a bit slower because it's effectively has to fetch all those 400 records or whatever it is, then apply the filter to the result. And that's where using native REST sources, particularly coming up in Apex 23.2, which I'll talk about shortly, could give you some advantages because you can do that filtering even from interactive reports on the server side, so on the Microsoft REST side, instead of having to drag all those records over and then filtering. You can do it by filtering in the REST API itself. So like I say, the one possible benefit of the Apex collection is really very similar to caching. You're just caching it in a collection locally, but it could get out of date, which is the downside of that. So if I just show you real quick on adding a file, so if we go to page 36, this is just a standard Apex file upload region. And then when I go to upload the file, it grabs the file from Apex application temp files and then calls this API, which you won't be surprised to see is another graph API. So I get the size of the file first, and you'll see why that's important in a moment. So there's two APIs for posting files to SharePoint. One that you use if the file is 4 megabytes or less, so for small files. And there's another API or a set of APIs you need to use if the file is larger than 4 megabytes. So in my case, I've set a hard limit of 60 megabytes in this global, and just say stop if the file is bigger than that. But if the file is smaller than that 4 megabyte size, then I can call an API directly to post that file and just use Apex Web Service, make a REST request and put that blob, pass the P-body blob, put that blob directly to SharePoint. It will, just like when you're using SharePoint yourself, if your file's already there, it'll overwrite it. But then if the file's bigger than 4 megabytes, in this case, that's what that global represents, then you have to create an upload session. So there is some information you have to pass in the payload to tell it basically the information about the file name, because you're then going to post sets of 60 or up to 60 megabytes worth of bytes to that upload session. My basic example here, I've said you can't upload a file bigger than 60 megabytes, so it's only sending bytes 1 to 60 megabytes worth of bytes to that upload session. But in reality, if you thought you were going to get files bigger than 60 megabytes, you'd have to loop through that blob and post to that upload session sets of 60 megabytes, essentially. And then so this is creating that upload session. I then pass the upload URL back from that session. And then I tell it you have to set the byte range you're going to post to that session. Like say, in this case, I'm only doing one iteration, and then post the actual bytes to that upload session URL. It's a little bit complicated, but like I say, the code's all there. You can take a look at that. The delete is very similar. I'm just capturing the delete and then find the API. Spend too much time on this. I'm calling this delete procedure when you delete a file, and it's calling yet another API with the drive and the item ID. So instead of having to know the whole path, if you deal with item IDs in SharePoint, it makes things a bit more straightforward. And I'm just doing a delete request to that endpoint and deleting the file. Download, similarly, when I click the download and you saw the file downloading, it is calling this API to get the SharePoint blob. Again, it's just another Apex Web Service make request request to grab the blob from SharePoint. And then I'm using the download Apex Data Export to download the file. All right, so that's the demo side. Actually, there's one more bit of demo. So one thing I wanted to do real quick is just to show you how I could create a page from scratch that's looking at the calendar entries. And with this, I'm going to use a REST source connector plugin that I created for essentially allowing you to paginate. So you can use a native REST source, but it will paginate through the two sets of 200 records for you. And so you can still use the native REST source functionality and still have it paginate through all the records. So to do this, I'm going to have to create a web credential to start with. So my credentials, I've got a little cheat sheet here. Scope is that. Client ID and client secret, the ones we used in the Postman demo. That's credential. And I go back into the application. I'm going to create a REST source. And I'm going to create this on this plugin, Microsoft Graph Calendar plugin that I've created. So this is going to be called Office Hours also. And one of the parameters, as we know, is the user ID. So I'm going to set a default value just so we can test it. Double check with everything. Okay. That's just confirming the path to the URL. I'm going to use the credentials we just created. And then I need to give it the proper URL that includes my Office 365 tenancy in it. And now I should be able to discover that service. So it's given me all a sample response to the first 200 rows or whatever. I'm going to create a REST source from that. So one of the things we'll notice from the standard REST source that I created, the actual Microsoft Graph API returns a sub-object for start and end date. So this end.datetime, Apex has just given datetime as the field name. So it's going to be more useful for us to call it end date. And we'll call the start one start date. So now I'm going to create a page quickly. Start blank page. go to the calendar region. Use REST source, office hours. So my plugin, which you'll see in a minute, also sets some default select parameters. So when you use that REST source, that plugin for REST source, it will default those parameters. But let's just see this running first. Oh, sorry, I've got to tell the calendar region what I want displayed. So subject for the display. This is where it makes it easier to select the start and end date. On page, I've got this new office hours page. And hopefully there are my calendar entries. So real quick, I'm going to look at the plugin. I have a blog post on creating this REST source connector plugin, so I won't go into too much detail here. But essentially, I am saying you give it certain procedures to call certain events during the life cycle of the plugin. So there's a discover procedure, a capabilities procedure. So if I just show you those two real quick. So in the capabilities procedure, you're just basically telling Apex what it's capable of, what your plugin is capable of. So if this plugin is operating in an interactive report, for example, you're showing 1 to 20 records, Apex can pass your plugin that, which records the user wants to see, and when they hit next, which records they're expecting to see next. So, or if you filter in an interactive report, this basically tells Apex, don't bother sending the filtering information to the plugin because it doesn't support filtering. But you should pass the pagination information because it does support pagination. And then the discovery procedure is what's called when you do the discover, when I first created that REST source. So you can see I'm adding these parameters for the user so they don't have to select those specific columns. Because in my case, I want the plugin to only return these columns in the select from the web service. And then you do the make REST request to show the response in the discovery. And then the final one is the fetch, which is if you're in an interactive report, Apex, and you're using this plugin via the REST source, Apex will pass in what page it's on, what page it's expecting, whether you've selected fetch all rows in an interactive report, and then you can you basically handle all that in this code. So I'm essentially looping again to fetch all the potential calendar entries. So it's an alternative route than I had for the pipeline type table function. That's all very interesting, but in Apex 23.2, which isn't quite out yet, but has been announced, I guess, there's a new OData REST source type, which kind of negates the need for the plugin in this particular case, because the Microsoft Graph services are OData services. So I haven't had a chance to try this out yet, but you get a whole bunch of extra options. So it looks like we will be able to, perform row search, results pagination, and Apex itself is going to look out for that OData next link. And Apex itself is going to follow that link to get the next 20 records or whatever you're doing. And Apex itself will be passing the filter parameters. And that's really the most exciting part of this new feature. Is if you're an interactive report and you type in the filter criteria, that will get passed to the next call to the REST service, and you'll only get the records back that you've requested in that filter criteria, rather than getting all 1,000 records back and then filtering them. So I'm looking forward to trying this out. All right, so that's the demo side. A few lessons learned that I've picked up over the years. So for the inbox scenario, for checking Office 365 inbox for new emails, you could obviously use an Apex automation. You'd only want to fetch the emails that have shown up since the last time you ran it. So you could use the Apex automation variables to say when the last time the automation ran, only fetch and pass that to the Graph API to say email receive date greater than or equal to that date. As I talked about in the presentation, just fetch the minimum fields required for whatever you're showing at the time. So if you're showing the inbox, don't fetch the full body for each email, just show a preview. You'll see a big difference in performance in, like say, network traffic for the email bodies coming across the network, as well as passing, Apex having to pass all of that extra JSON. The email API has attachments flag, so it'll tell you if there's going to be an attachment that you should go and get for that email. And that's how I highlighted that button in the demo. So don't bother going to get an attachment if there isn't one. Again, saving that extra round trip. And like I said, fetch the body of the attachments only when you need to. In the email use case that I used for the support email address, if you're sending outbound tickets, put some information in the ticket that you can then use and recognize when people respond to that email. So if you send, somebody creates a ticket, you could send them an email back saying ticket 1811 has been created, put that in brackets so that when they respond to it saying please close the ticket or whatever, you can find out which ticket it is. So you know the user from their email address, but you might not know the transaction. So include some identifiable information in there so you can clearly pick up which thread you're dealing with when it lands in your inbox. For SharePoint, we saw there's two different APIs, one for smaller files and one for larger files. So that upload session API, so you first have to establish an upload session and then upload chunks of data for the larger files. And don't forget, when you're posting a file to SharePoint, that file's getting indexed and it's searchable, and there are APIs you can call to search those files. So if you want to search the content of PDFs and Word documents and what have you, you can post them to SharePoint and then use the Graph APIs to search the content of those files. For calendars, obviously time zone is important. So either specify your user's time zone when you're calling the API, or use UTC and deal with it on the Apex side. There's also some useful APIs. Essentially, if you think of Outlook, the Outlook client that we all use, if you can do it in the Outlook client, it's a pretty good chance there's a REST service that will do that too. So obviously in Outlook, you can specify people and a time period and say, what's the best time for these 5 people to meet? So that's a find meeting times API. Or you could call the get schedule API with a list of people in a time frame and see whether they're free or busy during that time frame. So there's some useful information you can get there. Don't just assume it's just create calendar entry, list calendar entries. That essentially whatever you can do in the Outlook client, you can do in through the REST APIs. Some more general lessons learned. Use declarative Apex REST data sources where possible. If for no other reason, things like Apex 23.2 will come around and you'll suddenly find you can get rid of a bunch of code, which there's nothing better than doing that. If you can't, for some reason, use that, obviously it's going to take time for everybody to get up to Apex 23.2. Then you can create your own REST source connector plugin or use mine as a baseline, and add filtering logic to that maybe. So you're still using the native REST data sources, so you can still use caching and all that, those good features. And then failing that, or if you need to do a whole bunch of calculations on the response before you present it to the user, then think about pipeline table functions or even Apex collections. Make sure you handle pagination. No app is going to last for very long if you only ever fetch the first 200 records. So you might as well bite the bullet and put that in your code at the beginning. So look for that OData next link and fetch the next page if you need to fetch it. There's also some other really nice features in the Microsoft Graph APIs, one of which is webhooks. So you can set up Office 365 so that when, let's say, a file lands in SharePoint, it will call a web service that you define to say, hey, a file's just shown up in this folder. And of course, because all our Apex apps are running ORDs, we could have a ORDs API that receives that webhook notification. And then you can call back to Microsoft Graph to get the details of whatever it was that landed, the file or the email. That gives you the opportunity to work more real time with what's happening in your Office 365 environment. So instead of polling every 15 minutes, set up the webhook to say, okay, when it lands, then tell me by the Apex, by the ORD service, then I'll go take action immediately. There's also another neat feature called Delta queries. So again, in that polling scenario, you can tell the Graph API to, when you call it the first time, it will give you a response back with, like we had the OData next link, you get an attribute OData delta link. And if you then call it the second time, let's say an hour later, using that OData delta link, it will only give you the records that were created since that hour passed. And then it will give you another delta link so you can call it again the next time. So Microsoft's automatically doing that filtering for you of what's changed since the last time you called that API. So I definitely recommend looking into delta links if you're doing polling on inboxes or SharePoint files. Always look to reduce the payload size to improve performance. So use the select parameter to make the payload response narrower and the filter parameter to make it shorter. Saves on parsing time, saves on network time. If you are passing that data yourself, REST data sources handle it for you. If for some reason you're still on release 11 of the database, Apex, a REST data source will use Apex JSON. But if you're on 12C or higher, it will use the native JSON parser. And if you're building that code yourself, you should definitely use the native database JSON parsers because they're orders of magnitude faster than Apex JSON. And then you can try out these APIs yourself. There's a developer.microsoft.com Graph Explorer where you can navigate all of the different APIs as long as you're logged in with a user with sufficient credentials. And just take them for a spin, look and see what the payloads come back as, just to get familiar with them even before you get to the Postman stage of your development. Finally, be aware of rate limits. So each service has a rate limit. So if you think you're going to be calling the email service 1,000 times a minute, then there's a rate limit associated with that, and Microsoft will start giving you an error response back saying, hey, you're calling this API too often, you need to back off. So if you think you're going to be calling it frequently, you should be aware of those rate limits and have stuff in your code to handle it. So I don't remember the HTTP response you get back, but there's a certain response code like 304 or whatever. If you start getting that response, you need to back off, wait until a certain period of time, and these links will take you to what the rate limits are, how long you have to wait till you can try again. But if you think you're going to be calling them frequently, like pagination, it's best to put it in your code at the beginning, not have to deal with it when it becomes a problem. And take a look at this document, the Microsoft best practices on using Graph APIs. It's got a lot of the content that I've got here and more. And I have 2 sets of blogs. So there's a series on Apex and Office 365 integrations, which covers the how-to of everything you saw in the demo app. And a second blog, which is more recent, on REST Source Connector plugins. All right. As promised, that link on the right will get you to the PowerPoint slides. It's in a SharePoint folder. So you're welcome to grab those. And that is it for me. Tawfiq, are there any questions that I can answer on the call?
Yes, John, there are a couple of questions. I'll read
Okay.
out for you. So there is one from Jordan. Hi, John. If you send a mail via apex_mail.sendmail with a real email address, and we get back something like auto replies or holidays, etc., is there a way to access this answer in Outlook via Apex? Render it and do something smart with the answer.
The do something smart is more difficult, but the recognizing it is possible. So yeah, so when you send an email to a lot of these AP invoice email inboxes will automatically send a response back to the vendor saying thank you for your email. So it's a bit similar to an out of office. It's just an email that's going to land up in that inbox. So the only smart thing you can do is have keywords that you look out for, essentially, and say, okay, I got a response. I sent this email out expecting this action to happen. I got an out of office. I see who it came from, who's out of office. I can go and maybe update that transaction to say we're not expecting that response yet. But there's no magic bullet. You've got to pass the response and look for keywords like out of office or unavailable or that kind of thing. There's no sort of flag that I'm aware of that Microsoft gives you to say it's an out of office. You have to just pass the response.
We have one more question. Can I upload to OneDrive and get the short URL for the file?
I believe so. I don't know for 100% sure, but if you can do it for, the reason I'm 99% sure is pretty much anything you can do through SharePoint or OneDrive. If you can get that short URL back that way, you can get it back through the APIs as well. But I haven't done it myself, so I can't say for sure.
And we have one more interesting question. How to integrate with Microsoft Bot? Are there graph APIs for Microsoft Azure Bot?
I'm sure there are. I haven't done that, but what I have done, and I have a couple of blogs on this, are basically built a basic bot using Teams. So there are Teams, what they call inbound and outbound webhooks for Teams. So you can send a message to a Teams channel, and I have a blog on this. And that message will show up in the Teams channel, and then somebody could respond to that message. And that response, you can set up Teams to be a ORDS API. So you can kind of go back and forward. You send the message to the team, somebody in the team responds to the message. You receive that response via an ORDS REST service. You perform some more logic, maybe send another message back. But it's a very basic bot. And the inbound webhook example I have is in Teams, you can start a conversation. You can say, I think in my blog demo, I have one called WeatherBot. So you go to the Teams channel, you say, at WeatherBot, what's the weather in San Diego? It calls an ORDS web service. In your ORDS code, you go call up weather.com or whatever, get the response back and give it the response, and it shows up as if it was a bot, but there's no sort of conversational aspect to it. But the question that I didn't answer was the Microsoft bots, where it's a full bot service. I'm sure there are APIs for it, but I haven't used them.
Thank you so much, John, for this great session. I can't wait to see all the exciting integrations the Apex community would come up, taking lead from this session. I have
Awesome.
a couple of slides to conclude this session. Can I share my screen?
Yes, sure. Should be able to share it now.
Yes. 1 second. I hope you can see my screen. So if you want to learn the building blocks of what John covered today or other Apex concepts in general, you can make use of the training content that we have made available. Just go to apex.oracle.com/go/training to access this training content. Now, even if you are completely new to low-code app development, OCI, or Apex, you can kickstart your learning journey with Apex Foundations course. This 3.5 plus hour course coming directly from the Apex product team covers all the fundamentals of Oracle Apex. Just visit apex.oracle.com/go/foundations to take the foundations course. Also note that this course is available on LinkedIn Learning as well. Now, if you want to go deeper into low-code concepts, want to learn more than just fundamentals, you can take the Apex Developer Professional course. This 13 plus hour course covers soup to nuts, complete low-code app development with Oracle Apex. Also, every module in this course is supplemented with a hands-on lab so that you can practice along with the training videos. You can enroll and learn for free today on Oracle University by visiting apex.oracle.com/go/professional. To top up your learning and validate your learning, you can also get yourself certified. You can become Oracle Apex certified by taking the Oracle Apex Cloud Developer Professional course, professional exam. Although it's not mandatory to complete the Apex Developer Professional course to take this exam, the training videos and hands-on labs made available in the Apex Developer Professional course will greatly help you pass the exam. So you can register for the certification exam at apex.oracle.com/go/professional. Also note that the certification is now free for partners. Finally, we, the Apex product team, are here to listen and help you. You can reach us at oracle-application-express_ww@oracle.com. Whether you are a partner helping customers, whether you are a developer who has built a cool Apex app and you would want to showcase that app to the community, or if you have ideas for the next office hours session, just drop us an email. We would love to hear from you. That concludes the session. Also, if you have missed the previous office hours sessions, you can go and watch the missed officer session on our YouTube playlist. Just go to apex.oracle.com/go/playlist/jpack, where you can find all the previous recordings of this particular JPAC session. And here are some of the links that you can find all the Apex content. We have Apex shortcuts where you can find all the shortcuts related to Apex resources. And also you can see the Apex training URL there. That concludes the session. Thank you so much for joining. Once again, thank you so much, John, for joining in so late at night. Really appreciate it.
No problem. It was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. Thank you.